The air above Okinawa was thick with smoke and death. In April 1945, American troops clawed their way up a jagged escarpment nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge, a place where life and death were separated by a heartbeat and a few inches of mud. But amid the chaos, explosions, and screaming men, one figure stood apart. He carried no rifle. He wore no sidearm. He was a U.S. Army medic and the only soldier in World War II to step into the Pacific's bloodiest battlefield armed with nothing but faith. His name was Desmond Doss. Before he ever touched the cliffs of Okinawa, before he became a legend whispered among soldiers, Doss was just a skinny kid from Lynchburg, Virginia, born on February 7, 1919. He grew up during the Great Depression in a simple home where the Bible sat open more than any newspaper. His father, William Doss, was a carpenter and World War I veteran, a man hardened by battle but softened by regret. His mother, Bertha Doss, was a devout Seventh-day Adventist whose faith shaped her son's soul. From an early age, Desmond learned two conflicting truths: that the world could be cruel and violent, and that God commanded, "Thou shalt not kill." One moment from his boyhood never left him. A framed illustration of the Ten Commandments hung in the Doss home. One image in particular showed Cain standing over Abel, holding the weapon that ended his brother's life. Desmond stared at it often and wondered what could drive one man to take another's life. That single picture planted a seed that would define his destiny. As he grew older, the contradictions of his world deepened. His father's drinking and lingering trauma from World War I sometimes turned the Doss home into a battlefield of its own. Desmond often stepped between his father and mother during arguments, trembling, scared, but determined to stop the violence. One night, when his father pulled a gun during a family dispute, Desmond wrestled it away. That moment carved a promise into his heart. He would never again touch a weapon in anger. By his teens, America was changing. The drums of another war echoed from Europe and the Pacific. Yet Desmond's world revolved around his church, his work, and his faith. He took a job at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, helping build vessels for the Navy. He wasn't blind to the evil rising overseas, Hitler's conquests, the brutality of Imperial Japan, but he believed his duty was to heal, not to harm. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States was thrust into global war. Across the country, young men enlisted in droves, driven by anger, patriotism, or vengeance. Desmond felt that same pull, but for different reasons. He couldn't stand aside while others fought and bled. His country needed help, and he was determined to serve, but without betraying the commandment that had guided his entire life. So, in April 1942, Desmond Doss enlisted in the U.S. Army. He didn't want a weapon. He didn't want to take a life. He wanted to save them. When he stood before the recruiting officer and refused to carry a gun, people thought he was joking. The Army didn't quite know what to do with him. He requested to serve as a combat medic, a role where he could be close to the battlefield yet true to his faith. His decision baffled almost everyone around him. Some called him a coward. Others called him crazy. But in his mind, there was no contradiction, only conviction. He once said, "I couldn't picture myself with a gun, taking someone's life. I just couldn't. But I could help people. I could save lives." Desmond's quiet resolve would soon be tested beyond imagination. Because while America celebrated its heroes who carried rifles into battle, the Army wasn't ready for a man who refused to touch one. By the time he finished his physical training, Doss was already an outsider in uniform. He refused to train on Saturdays, the Sabbath according to his Seventh-day Adventist belief. He refused to handle or even touch a weapon, citing the commandment he had sworn never to break. His superiors were confused. His fellow soldiers were furious. They saw his refusal not as faith, but as betrayal. Behind his back, they whispered that he was useless, Some mocked him, others threatened him. A few even suggested he be thrown out of the army entirely. But Desmond Doss stood firm. He didn't fight back, he didn't argue, he prayed. To him, the true measure of courage wasn't taking a life, it was saving one, even when everyone around you hated you for it. And though no one knew it yet, this quiet, unarmed soldier from Virginia would soon prove that courage isn't defined by the weapon you carry, but by the weight you're willing to bear. When Desmond Doss reported to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the spring of 1942, he walked into a world built on obedience, weapons, and war. For a man whose faith taught peace and compassion, the Army was the ultimate test. The U.S. military was expanding fast, training millions of men for a global fight. Drill sergeants barked orders. Recruits shouted back, rifles in hand, as they marched in rows across the training field. Doss, standing among them, looked out of place, not because of his size or strength, but because of the empty space in his hands. He didn't carry a gun. He wouldn't even touch one. At first, his commanding officers thought it was a misunderstanding. "Private Doss, pick up your rifle," one sergeant barked. "I'm sorry, sir, I can't do that." That single sentence set off months of conflict that would nearly break him. To many in his company, Doss was a disgrace. His unit, the 77th Infantry Division, was filled with men preparing to kill or be killed. They couldn't comprehend how someone could refuse to bear arms and still expect to fight beside them. Doss's fellow soldiers mocked him during drills. They hit his boots. They cursed him as a coward. Some even threatened his life while he slept. He was labeled a conscientious objector, a term that carried a heavy stigma during World War II, but Desmond didn't see himself that way. "I'm not a conscientious objector," he told his officers. "I am a conscientious cooperator. I want to serve, just not by taking life." The Army, however, didn't have a category for men like him. His refusal to bear arms became a legal issue. His superiors filed paperwork to court-martial him, accusing him of disobeying direct orders. Doss faced the possibility of prison, all because of his faith. During the hearings, he stood before military judges and lawyers who demanded he explain himself. Doss didn't argue or debate. He simply spoke the truth that guided him since childhood. "While everyone else is taking life, I'll be saving it." His mother's Bible accompanied him everywhere, tucked carefully into his pocket, a reminder that his duty to God stood above all else. In the end, his case reached the attention of higher command. The U.S. military ruled that as a Seventh-day Adventist, Doss had the constitutional right to refuse to carry arms. The court-martial was dismissed. He could remain in the Army on one condition. He had to perform his duties as a medic, unarmed, in combat zones. That decision marked a turning point, both for Doss and for the men who hated him. They still didn't trust him, they still mocked him, but slowly, quietly, they began to notice something different about him. In training, Doss became known for his work ethic and calm precision. He learned how to stop bleeding, set broken bones, and drag men to safety under fire. He memorized every medical technique the Army could teach him. When others rested, Doss studied. When others complained, he volunteered for extra duty. And when anyone was injured, even the men who had tormented him, Doss was always the first to help. During a grenade drill gone wrong, one soldier was wounded by shrapnel. Before the sergeant could even shout for a medic, Doss was already on his knees, applying pressure to the wound, stopping the bleeding, and saving the man's life. For the first time, his fellow soldiers saw what courage looked like without a gun. But challenges kept coming. Because Doss refused to work on Saturday, his Sabbath, officers often tried to force him into extra duties as punishment. When he quietly declined, he was disciplined, humiliated, and berated. Still, he never broke. He would finish every assigned task before sunset Friday, then spend Saturday praying, reading scripture, and helping anyone in need. The very men who once mocked him began to respect his consistency. Even if they didn't understand his beliefs, they couldn't ignore his conviction. When the 77th Infantry Division received orders for deployment to the Pacific, Doss packed his medical gear, his uniform, and his Bible. No weapon, no sidearm. He knew the front lines of war would be chaos, blood, fire, screams, and death. He knew soldiers would doubt him again. And he knew that if he failed, no one would remember his name. But Desmond wasn't looking for recognition. He was looking for purpose. The army that had once tried to court-martial him was now sending him to some of the most brutal battles of the Pacific, Guam, Leyte, and eventually Okinawa, where his belief in peace would collide with the reality of war. For Desmond Doss, the true test of faith wasn't in refusing to fight. It was in standing unarmed in the middle of hell and still believing he could make a difference. By mid-1944, Corporal Desmond Doss was thousands of miles from Virginia, sailing across the Pacific Ocean with the 77th Infantry Division, the men who once laughed at him now standing beside him on the deck of a troop transport ship bound for Guam. The air was thick with anticipation. The Pacific War was brutal, unpredictable, and fought island by island. The Japanese defenders had turned every patch of rock and jungle into a fortress, and American troops knew what awaited them: ambushes, artillery, and death hidden in the trees. Doss stood quietly at the rail, clutching his Bible, the same one his mother had given him when he left home. He didn't pray for victory. He prayed for strength, strength to save, not to kill. When the invasion of Guam began in July 1944, the 77th Division waded ashore under fire. Mortars exploded, sand churned beneath the soldiers' boots, and the air filled with the crack of Japanese machine guns. Desmond Doss moved with his unit, ducking behind cover, scanning the field for wounded men. He had no weapon, only a first aid kit, morphine syrettes, and courage. Within minutes of the landing, casualties began to pile up. A soldier screamed for help from an open patch of ground swept by gunfire. No one dared move until Doss crawled out, flat against the earth, inch by inch through the sand. Bullets hissed overhead. When he reached the man, he pressed gauze against the wound, lifted him onto his shoulders, and dragged him back through the crossfire to safety. It was the first of dozens he would save that day. For hours, Doss worked without rest, patching, carrying, comforting. When his hands bled from friction and his knees were torn raw, he simply whispered a prayer and kept going. His commanding officer later wrote that Doss performed with the calmness of a man untouched by fear. By the time night fell, the men of his platoon had seen something they couldn't explain. The same soldier they had mocked for refusing to fight had just risked his life for everyone else. That night, sitting in a shallow foxhole under the tropical rain, one of the sergeants looked at Doss and said quietly, "Maybe you ain't so crazy after all." After Guam, the 77th moved to Leyte in the Philippines, another vital battleground in General Douglas MacArthur's campaign to liberate the islands. The terrain was worse than Guam: thick jungle, knee-deep mud, and near-constant ambushes. Doss carried the same battered medical pouch, heavier each week with the burden of saving lives. In Leyte, malaria spread faster than bullets. The humidity rotted clothes and skin. Soldiers lost friends to disease, exhaustion, and sniper fire. During one intense engagement near Ormac Bay, a mortar shell exploded close to Doss's position. He was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing, but he crawled to the nearest wounded soldier. Despite shrapnel cutting his leg, he ignored his own pain and carried the man out. Then another, then another. By the end of the campaign, Desmond Doss had treated and evacuated
dozens of wounded men, often under enemy fire. His selflessness began to change opinions within the 77th. He was still the odd one, the man who prayed instead of cursed, who read his Bible under a helmet for shade. But now, men who once ridiculed him started calling out for him when they were hit. "Medic! Doss! Get Doss!" The army had sent him to war reluctantly. Now his unit couldn't imagine facing battle without him.
Doss's courage wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and absolute. He didn't shout or boast, he simply acted. Whenever the shelling stopped, he would move through the wreckage, checking for movement or faint breathing. Many times, Japanese snipers still watched from the tree line, waiting for any motion, yet Doss kept going. He once told a chaplain after Leyte, "If I can hear a man calling for help, I can't just leave him. It don't matter whose side he's on." And he meant it. There are verified accounts of Doss treating wounded Japanese soldiers when he could reach them safely, applying bandages or morphine before moving on. His belief was simple. Every life mattered.
By the time the 77th Division was rotated off the line, the officers' reports on Doss painted a clear picture. Exemplary conduct under fire, exceptional courage, displayed devotion to duty beyond expectations. He received commendations for bravery, but Doss never mentioned them. He wrote home to his mother instead, thanking her for the Bible and her prayers. "They helped me more than you know," he wrote. Back in Virginia, his father, William, struggled to understand how his boy, the one who swore never to touch a gun, had become a hero in the thick of war. But deep down, he was proud.
After months of combat, Doss could have asked for reassignment. He'd seen enough blood to last a lifetime. But the war was far from over. The U.S. was preparing for the most brutal and decisive battle of the Pacific. Okinawa, the final step before an invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese High Command had fortified the island into a maze of bunkers, tunnels, and cliffs. Intelligence warned that it would be a slaughter. Some generals predicted tens of thousands of American casualties. Doss's unit, the 77th, was assigned to one of the toughest sectors, the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff the soldiers nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. As the men packed their gear, cleaned their rifles, and checked their ammunition, Doss did what he always did. He filled his medic bag with bandages, plasma, morphine, and water, then placed his Bible on top. He didn't know it yet, but Okinawa would make his name immortal. And before it was over, he would save 75 men, alone, without firing a single shot. The Battle of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. To the world, it was another step toward Japan's defeat. To the men of the 77th Infantry Division, it was a descent into hell. Okinawa stretched across the Pacific like a green serpent, cliffs, caves, and ridges carved by centuries of wind and rain. But beneath its beauty lay the most formidable defenses the American military had ever faced. Over 100,000 Japanese troops were entrenched across the island, determined to fight to the last man. Desmond Doss landed with his division on the western beaches, surrounded by waves of Marines and soldiers pouring ashore under a gray sky. Naval guns thundered offshore, pounding enemy positions with deafening roars. The ground shook beneath their boots. The smell of salt and cordite filled the air. This was no ordinary battle. It was the last great confrontation of the Pacific War. And for Doss, it was the place where faith would be tested beyond all human limits. In the southern sector of Okinawa loomed a cliff so steep and jagged that soldiers stared up at it in silence. The Japanese had turned the top into a fortress network. Machine gun nests, mortars, tunnels, and hidden bunkers connected through the rock. The Americans called it the Maeda Escarpment. To the men who had to climb it, it was Hacksaw Ridge. because every attempt to take it felt like being shredded by invisible blades. The 77th Division was ordered to capture the ridge in late April. Before the assault, officers briefed the men with grim honesty. Casualties would be high. The Japanese weren't retreating, they were waiting. As the sun set, soldiers whispered quiet prayers or stared into the dark. Doss sat apart reading from his small, worn Bible by the light of a flickering candle stub. The men who had once mocked him now watched in silence. No one laughed anymore.
At dawn, the assault began. Ropes and cargo nets dangled from the cliff face as hundreds of soldiers began climbing hand over hand, boots slipping on wet rock. The smell of gunpowder drifted down from above. Doss climbed behind the infantry, carrying his medical kit, a stretcher, and his faith. As they reached the top, silence hung for a moment, then exploded into chaos. Japanese machine guns opened fire from concealed positions. Mortar rounds burst among the troops. Men screamed and fell, tumbling back over the ridge. The first assault was repelled within minutes. Bodies hung tangled in the ropes. Blood stained the ground. Doss worked feverishly among the fallen, dragging the wounded to the edge, lowering them down with makeshift slings. The enemy's fire was relentless. He never picked up a weapon. One soldier later recalled, quote, "You'd see Doss kneeling in the open, patching a man up while rounds cracked all around him. He never ducked, never hesitated." Close quote.
The Japanese defenders at Hacksaw Ridge were among the most disciplined fighters in the Imperial Army. They used underground tunnels to appear and vanish at will, striking from unexpected angles. Even wounded soldiers would feign death, pulling grenades when medics approached. For Doss, every rescue meant gambling with his life. He crawled through mud mixed with blood, feeling for a pulse, checking breath, ignoring fear. When shells burst nearby, he would press his face into the dirt, whispering, "Lord, give me one more." The fighting raged for days. Each time the Americans gained a foothold, counterattacks forced them back. The cost was measured in lives, dozens each hour. Doss treated friend and foe alike. He once carried a wounded Japanese soldier to a sheltered spot before returning to his own men. His comrades couldn't understand it, but they didn't question him anymore. They had seen what he could do. In the lulls between attacks, Doss moved among the foxholes, checking on the living. He cleaned wounds, changed dressings, whispered encouragement. To the men of Company B, he had become more than a medic. He was a symbol of hope. One corporal later said, "When Doss was around, it felt like maybe we'd make it through the day." The Japanese artillery was merciless, pounding the ridge at random intervals. Rain turned the soil into slick red mud. The smell of death hung heavy over everything. Through it all, Doss never lost his composure. He slept little, ate almost nothing, and prayed constantly. When others cursed their fate, he thanked God for one more sunrise, one more chance to help. By early May 1945, the 77th prepared for yet another assault on the ridge. They had taken it twice, only to be driven back by counterattacks. Morale was low. Men were exhausted and traumatized. But Doss refused to waver. He patched, carried, and comforted through the night before the attack. Even when ordered to rest, he continued to check every foxhole for signs of life. A sergeant who once despised him sat beside him quietly and asked, "Doss, you ever get scared?" Desmond smiled faintly. "Sure," he said, "but when I'm helping a man, I feel closer to God than anywhere else." That morning, May 5th, 1945, the battle for Hacksaw Ridge truly began. It would become one of the bloodiest single days of the Pacific Campaign, and the day Desmond Doss etched his name into history. The morning of May 5th, 1945 began with the rumble of artillery. The sky above Okinawa was a dull gray, heavy with smoke and ash. The men of the 77th Infantry Division gathered at the base of the Maeda escarpment, exhausted but determined. They had been here before. Each attempt to take the ridge had ended the same way, in chaos, blood, and retreat. But this time, the orders were clear. Hold it, no matter the cost. Among them stood Corporal Desmond Doss, unarmed, thin, and calm. While others checked rifles, grenades, and bayonets, Doss tightened the straps of his medical bag. No weapon, no armor, just faith. The first wave climbed the cargo nets as Navy guns thundered behind them. The ground shook, and the smell of cordite stung the air. When the troops reached the top, silence greeted them. The eerie stillness that only meant one thing. The enemy was waiting. Then came the eruption. Machine guns opened from hidden caves. Mortars rained down. Japanese soldiers emerged from tunnels like ghosts, firing and vanishing into smoke. Within minutes, the ridge became a nightmare. Bodies fell everywhere. Shouts from medics echoed through the smoke. And Desmond Doss went to work. He sprinted into the open, ignoring the bullets whipping through the air. One man was hit in the leg. Doss crawled to him, tied a tourniquet, and dragged him behind a rock. Another was bleeding from the chest. Doss ripped open a plasma pack and inserted the needle while lying flat in the dirt. For every man who fired a rifle, Doss saved one who couldn't. Shells exploded nearby, showering him with mud. He kept moving, calm and precise, his lips whispering the same words again and again. Lord, help me get one more, just one more.
By midday, the Japanese counterattack came in full force. Wave after wave struck the 77th Division. Grenades burst among the foxholes. The line crumbled. Officers screamed for retreat. Hundreds of Americans scrambled back toward the edge of the cliff. Some climbed down the ropes, others fell. The ridge became a graveyard of shattered helmets and broken bodies. But Doss stayed. He looked around at the wounded who couldn't move, dozens of them scattered across the plateau, groaning, calling for help. He couldn't leave them. While his entire unit withdrew, Doss ran toward the gunfire. He began pulling men to the edge one by one, lowering them down with ropes he tied by hand. The drop was nearly 400 feet. There was no pulley system, no backup, just Doss tying knots, bracing himself, and praying. After each rescue, he whispered the same words, "Please, Lord, help me get one more." He would crawl back through the smoke, find another wounded soldier, drag him to safety, and lower him down. Then do it again, and again, and again.
Eyewitness accounts describe Doss's movements as almost superhuman. For 12 straight hours, he worked alone under fire. He treated shattered limbs, crushed lungs, and mangled faces. When morphine ran out, he improvised, using bandages, shirts, even rifle slings to stop bleeding. He was hit by shrapnel twice, but refused evacuation. At one point, a Japanese sniper's bullet grazed his helmet, slicing the fabric near his ear. Doss didn't flinch. He just kept working. Each time he lowered a man down the cliff, the soldiers below could barely believe what they saw. The first few wounded who reached the bottom said, "It's Doss, he's still up there." When commanders realized what was happening, they organized stretchers at the base, ready to receive more. But no one could explain how Doss kept surviving. Private Ralph Baker, one of the men he saved, later said, "Every time we thought he was dead, he'd show up with another man. He just wouldn't stop." By nightfall, he had rescued approximately 75 men, though Doss himself never claimed a number. He said, "I don't know how many. It wasn't me doing it anyway." The story spread through the division like wildfire. Soldiers who had once cursed him now prayed for him. Officers who had doubted him ordered patrols to cover his position. When the 77th regrouped for another assault, they asked for only one thing before going up the ridge again: Don't start until Doss finishes praying. That was no small request. In the Army, orders came from officers. But here, an entire unit waited on the prayer of a man who refused to carry a gun. Doss's heroics didn't end that day. Over the next week, he continued to serve on the ridge, treating wounded soldiers under constant bombardment. On May 21, 1945, he was seriously wounded by a grenade blast while tending to others. His legs were shredded with shrapnel. As medics carried him back, he spotted another wounded soldier and insisted they take that man first. While waiting, Doss was hit again. A sniper's bullet shattered his arm. Using his own rifle stock as a splint, he crawled 300 yards to safety. He was finally evacuated from Okinawa, weak, bloodied, but alive. When his commanding officer compiled the reports, the truth was undeniable. Desmond Doss, the unarmed medic they once tried to court-martial, had saved 75 men in a single battle, each rescue verified by witness testimony. His Medal of Honor citation would later read, "He remained in the fire-swept area with many stricken men, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to safety." When Doss finally left Okinawa, he carried home no weapon, no trophies, only scars, and a small Bible with its pages soaked in blood and rain. He had done the impossible, faced the full fury of war without firing a single bullet, and in doing so, he proved that the greatest courage is not found in the destruction of enemies, but in the salvation of friends. When the sun fell behind the horizon on May 5, 1945, Hacksaw Ridge turned into a silhouette of fire and smoke. The battlefield was an inferno, the kind where screams faded into the thunder of artillery, and the ground itself trembled like a living thing. The Japanese had cut off every escape route. The 77th Infantry Division's forward line had disintegrated, and the wounded lay scattered across the top of the escarpment. Hundreds of them, alive but helpless. Most men had already retreated, but one remained. Corporal Desmond Doss, armed with nothing but faith and bandages, refused to leave Okinawa.
He knelt beside a soldier gasping for air, the man's chest torn open by shrapnel. As he pressed a bandage against the wound, Doss whispered softly, "Dear Lord, help me get one more." He said it not once, but again and again, after every man he saved, the same 7 words. The phrase became a rhythm that guided him through the night, the pulse of faith in a place where faith had no reason to exist. Doss was completely alone on top of that ridge. No lights, no backup, just a faint glow of fire, the crack of rifles, and the cries of the dying. He crawled from one body to the next, guided by sound. A faint moan, a broken whisper, a hand reaching through the mud. Each time he found a man alive, he patched him up with what little he had left. His hands trembled from exhaustion, his uniform soaked with blood, his and others.
At the cliff's edge, Doss created a makeshift lowering system from spare ropes and litter straps. There was no pulley, no engineering, just knots tied by a medic who'd never learned mountain work. He braced his body against a tree root and began lowering men one by one. Every descent was a fight. The rope burned his hands raw, the weight dragging against his wounded shoulders. The cliff face was slick with rain and blood. Some men panicked halfway down, others passed out from pain, but Doss never let go. When his strength faltered, he prayed aloud, begging for just enough energy to finish one more descent. From the base of the ridge, soldiers on stretcher duty could hardly believe what they were seeing, bodies being lowered slowly through the smoke, each one alive. "Where's this coming from?" one medic shouted.
"It's Doss! He's still up there!"
From dusk until dawn, Doss didn't stop. He crawled through Japanese territory again and again, pulling men from shell holes, dragging them through fire, lifting them onto the rope, and sending them down. He was hit in the leg by a piece of shrapnel, but ignored it. Later, a bullet grazed his arm. He tied it up himself and kept going. He moved like a shadow, low, deliberate, fearless. Even the enemy couldn't explain him. Japanese soldiers later admitted that medics were usually prime targets, but that night they couldn't bring themselves to shoot the lone man tending the wounded. They said it felt like he was protected by something unseen.
Private Jack Glover, one of the men Doss saved, recalled the moment he was hit. "I was lying there, bleeding out, and I figured that was it. Then I felt someone grab me under the arms. It was Doss. I told him, 'Forget me, save yourself.' But he just smiled and said, 'You're going home, Jack.'" Doss carried Glover more than 200 yards under machine gun fire, patched his wounds, and lowered him off the cliff. That story was repeated again and again, with different names, different faces, all ending the same way. A soldier who should have died made it off Hacksaw Ridge alive.
By midnight, Doss's body was near collapse. His hands were torn and blistered. His uniform was shredded. He hadn't eaten or slept in nearly 36 hours. Every breath came with pain. Still, when his strength gave out, he whispered, "One more, Lord. Please, just one more." He found another man, then another, until even he couldn't remember how many he had saved. When dawn broke, the ridge was silent. Smoke drifted over the battlefield. The bodies that had once littered the ground were gone, carried to safety by a medic who never carried a weapon. When the last man was lowered, Doss finally collapsed beside the edge, too weak to move. Below him, soldiers who'd been rescued were gathering, looking up through the haze, trying to spot the figure who had done the impossible. One officer whispered, almost in disbelief, "That man just saved the whole company." By the Army's count, Doss rescued 75 wounded soldiers that night, everyone verified by witness testimony. Some said it was more. Doss himself refused to claim a number. "I just kept praying for one more," he said later, "until there were no more to get." The next morning, when the 77th Infantry Division prepared to attack the ridge again, they refused to move without him. Officers radioed command, "We're waiting on Doss. We won't go up without him." When he was found resting at the base, dehydrated and bandaged, the men gathered around him in silence. They didn't salute. They didn't cheer. They just stared, because words didn't fit what they'd witnessed.
For Desmond Doss, the night on Hacksaw Ridge wasn't about heroism. He saw himself as a servant, not a savior. In his quiet voice, he once explained, "When you've got a man down and you hear him calling for help, you don't think about anything else. You just go." That simplicity, that unshakable humanity, turned one unarmed medic into a legend of the United States Army. When historians later examined the battle, they called Doss's rescue one of the most extraordinary acts of bravery ever recorded in military history. But for Doss, it was never about recognition. It was about faith, a faith strong enough to walk into hell and bring 75 souls back out.
The guns on Okinawa had fallen silent, but the echoes of the battle still haunted every man who fought there. Among the wounded carried off the ridge was a medic, frail, pale, with a shattered arm and leg filled with shrapnel, Corporal Desmond T. Doss. He was evacuated on May 21, 1945, barely conscious, clutching the small, blood-stained Bible his wife Dorothy had given him. The battle was over, but his war wasn't. Doss's body had paid the price for his mission. A grenade explosion had ripped through his legs, leaving deep, infected wounds. Days later, as he waited for evacuation, A Japanese sniper's bullet smashed through his left arm, fracturing the bone. He refused to call for help. Instead, he used a rifle stock to splint the broken limb and crawled to safety, 300 yards through mud and blood. When doctors finally treated him, they realized the extent of his injuries: nerve damage, multiple infections, and malnutrition from weeks of frontline service. For months, he lay in military hospitals, his body frail, but his spirit untouched. Even there, Doss comforted others. He'd move bed to bed, praying with soldiers who couldn't sleep, whispering the same words that had carried him through Okinawa. "The Lord is with you, brother. You're not alone."
The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The same army that had once threatened to court-martial Doss for refusing to carry a rifle was now preparing to award him the nation's highest military honor. His commanding officer, Captain Jack Glover, who had once called him a liability, wrote in his report, "He was one of the bravest persons alive, and he showed more courage than any man I've ever known." The official paperwork for the Medal of Honor began immediately. Eyewitness accounts poured in, soldiers who had been lowered off the ridge, men who'd seen him under fire, officers who swore he'd saved entire platoons. There was no debate. His actions weren't just brave, they redefined what courage meant.
It was a bright, crisp morning in Washington, D.C., when Desmond Doss, still limping from his wounds, stood on the south lawn of the White House. Before him, under the autumn sun, stood President Harry S. Truman, surrounded by generals, reporters, and fellow soldiers. Doss wore his formal Army uniform. The Medal of Honor ribbon rested in Truman's hand. The president looked him in the eye and said, "I'm proud of you. You're the bravest little man I ever met." Those who were there said Truman's voice trembled slightly, not out of ceremony, but respect. He pinned the medal on Doss's chest. The crowd applauded, but Doss's head stayed bowed. He whispered a quiet "thank you," then stepped back. The official citation read, "Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of desperately dangerous conditions, Private First Class Doss saved the lives of 75 men. His name became a symbol throughout the 77th Infantry Division for courage and faith. The man who refused to touch a weapon had become one of the most decorated soldiers in American history." After the ceremony, reporters surrounded him, asking how he'd done it, how a man could walk through gunfire without firing back. Doss answered in the same calm, gentle tone that defined him. "I just didn't feel I could take life, but I could save it." He never bragged, he never dramatized. He always said the same thing, that he was just doing what he believed God wanted him to do. When a journalist called him a hero, Doss smiled slightly and said, "The real heroes are the ones who didn't come back." That humility struck everyone who met him. His fellow soldiers described him as quiet, soft-spoken, but unbreakable, a man whose courage made faith tangible. News of his Medal of Honor spread quickly across America. Churches praised him as a man of conscience. Veterans honored him as a brother in arms. Letters flooded his home in Virginia, from mothers who'd lost sons, from soldiers who'd been inspired by his faith, from children who wanted to know if he'd really prayed in the middle of battle. Hollywood wanted his story immediately. He declined. He said the war was about the men who served, not the man who prayed. In the years following, Doss received other medals: 2 Bronze Stars for valor in Guam and Leyte, 3 Purple Hearts, and recognition from nearly every Veterans Association in the country. But none of those mattered to him as much as one thing: that he had stayed true to his beliefs and saved lives without taking any. After the war, Doss returned home to Virginia and lived a quiet life with his wife, Dorothy. He raised a son, Desmond Jr., and worked as a carpenter and a farmhand. He suffered from chronic injuries. One lung had collapsed from tuberculosis contracted during the war, and he spent years in and out of hospitals. Even so, he never complained. He spent his time visiting other veterans, offering prayer and encouragement. When asked what he thought of the Medal of Honor, he said, "It belongs to God. He's the one who gave me the strength." In the Army, courage is often measured in bullets and victories. But Desmond Doss changed that. He proved that valor isn't about killing for your country, it's about sacrificing for your fellow man. The same officers who had once doubted him now spoke his name with reverence. Many of the men he saved visited him years later, bringing their families, showing him the lives that existed because of one man's faith. To them, Doss wasn't just a medic. He was a living reminder that conscience and courage can exist side by side. As America moved on from World War II, Doss's story faded from headlines but remained etched in history. A quiet example of what it means to stand firm when everyone else bows. He had entered war as a conscientious objector. He left it as a conscientious warrior, a man who fought without hate, healed without hesitation, and stood without fear.
The guns had long gone silent. The Pacific was calm again. But for Desmond T. Doss, the war never truly ended. He carried it with him, not as fear or regret, but as memory, faith, and purpose. Life after the battle. When Doss returned home to Lynchburg, Virginia, he wasn't greeted by parades or fanfare. He was greeted by hospital walls. Years of frontline service had left his body broken. The tuberculosis he caught in the Pacific ravaged his lungs. Doctors removed one entirely and 5 ribs just to save his life. He spent more than 5 years in and out of veterans' hospitals, often bedridden, weak, and coughing. Through it all, Dorothy, his wife, never left his side. She read to him, prayed with him, and reminded him that faith had carried him through worse. When he finally regained enough strength to walk again, Doss settled into a modest life in rural Alabama. No speeches, no headlines, just peace. The one thing he had never found on Okinawa.
Desmond Doss lived like the man he had always been, humble, hardworking, devoted to faith. He built furniture, tended gardens, and volunteered at his local church. He rarely spoke about the war unless someone asked directly, and even then, he kept his words short. When veterans visited him, some of the men he had saved, they often brought their families. Doss would smile, shake their hands, and say softly, "You made it home. That's all that matters." For him, heroism was never a title. It was a duty fulfilled. For decades, Doss's name quietly faded into the background of history, known mostly within the Seventh-day Adventist community and among military historians. But his story refused to disappear. In 1967, a documentary titled The Conscientious Objector was produced, telling his story in his own words. It reintroduced Doss to a new generation of Americans who were struggling with the Vietnam War and questions of faith, duty, and conscience. He didn't give many interviews, but whenever he did, his message was clear. "I just wanted to serve my country without compromising what I believed in." His humility stood in sharp contrast to the politics of the time. He wasn't a protester. He wasn't a preacher. He was simply a man who believed that courage didn't need violence to exist. For decades, Hollywood had wanted to tell Doss's story. Studios approached him with offers, each one rejected. He was afraid they would turn it into fiction, exaggerate the violence, or glorify him beyond truth. It wasn't until 2001, near the end of his life, that he finally gave his blessing for a film adaptation, as long as the story remained accurate and respectful. He didn't live to see it finished. In 2016, Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge hit theaters, starring Andrew Garfield as Doss. The film stunned audiences, earning 6 Academy Award nominations and 2 wins. More importantly, it reignited the story of a man who walked into hell without a gun. Veterans who had never heard his name before suddenly spoke it with reverence. Younger generations discovered what true moral conviction looked like. And millions were reminded that faith, when tested by fire, can become the strongest armor of all.
In American military history, Desmond Doss stands alone. He wasn't the first conscientious objector, but he was the first to earn the Medal of Honor for it. He proved that belief and bravery aren't opposites, they're reflections of the same courage. His legacy reshaped how the U.S. Army treated men of conscience. After his service, the military introduced stronger protections for non-combatant soldiers and recognized the value of medics who served without weapons. Today, Doss's name appears in military ethics courses, sermons, and even medical schools. He is studied not as a hero of war, but as a hero of humanity, a man who placed compassion above combat.
Dorothy, the love of his life, died in the tragic car accident in 1991. The loss devastated him. For the first time since Okinawa, Doss felt truly alone. Years later, he remarried Frances Duman, who cared for him during his final years as his health continued to fade. On March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, Desmond Doss passed away in Piedmont, Alabama. He was married with full military honors at the Chattanooga National Cemetery, the same ground where soldiers who once mocked him now lay beside him in peace. His gravestone bears no grand title, just his name, his rank, and 3 simple words: Medal of Honor.
Decades later, historians still argue over strategy, politics, and the causes of World War II, but no one debates the courage of Desmond Doss. He entered war with no weapon, no hatred, and no intent to kill, and left as a man who had saved 75 lives through sheer faith and willpower. He showed the world that strength isn't in the hand that strikes, but in the heart that endures. When asked what message he hoped people would take from his life, Doss once said, "Just stand by what you believe is right, even if the whole world calls you wrong." That is the legacy of Desmond Doss, a legacy that transcends war, religion, and time itself. A reminder that one man's faith can move mountains, or, in his case, climb one and save 75 souls on the way down. In 2016, when Hacksaw Ridge ended, theaters across America fell silent. The audience didn't clap right away. They just sat there, stunned, because they had just watched something real. The closing shot showed the real Desmond Doss being lifted from a stretcher in archival footage, thin, fragile, eyes full of light. And in that moment, it didn't feel like history. It felt like holiness.